All right, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and good evening. And I also do want to thank Mark for agreeing to participate in tonight's debate. And I really want to say how privileged I am to be sharing the platform with Mark tonight. We've had several discussions over the course of this semester, and I'd say we're pretty good philosophical buddies. And so it's really a privilege to get to participate in this with him this evening. Also, I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm pretty blown away that you would give up your Friday night to come think about whether or not God exists. So it's pretty cool. It gives me some hope for our generation. To give credit where credit is due, the opening arguments I'll be presenting tonight were developed by a man named William Lane Craig. So I know that most of you are believers or non-believers, and I suspect that many of you, when you came in tonight, said, I'm going to check my own views at the door, and I'm going to assess the arguments as objectively as possible. I welcome that challenge. You see, the question of God's existence is of interest not only to religion, but also to philosophy. Therefore, as a philosopher, I'm going to approach tonight's question philosophically, from the standpoint of reason and argument. I'm convinced that there are better arguments for theism than for atheism. So in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there's no good reason to think that atheism is true, and second, that there are good reasons to think that theism is true. Now, I'll leave it up to Mark to present his arguments for atheism before I respond to them. But in this opening speech, I want to sketch briefly 5 lines of evidence in favor of God's existence. As a scholar, I think that God makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience, including philosophical, scientific, moral, historical, and existential considerations. So what are some of these data? Well, number 1, the origin of the universe. The question of why anything at all exists is the most profound question of philosophy. The philosopher Derek Parfit says, "No question is more sublime than why there is a universe, why there is anything rather than nothing." Typically, atheists have answered this question by saying that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophically and scientifically, to think that the universe began to exist. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of the past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. Mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradiction. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. This shows that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, wrote, quote, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature, nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." But that entails that since past events are not just ideas, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events cannot go back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13.7 billion years ago, in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. What makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at the Big Bang. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. Now, this puts the atheist in a very awkward position. As Anthony Kenny of Oxford University urges, a proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But surely that doesn't make sense. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. Now, from the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical. Now, there are only two possible candidates that could fit such a description, either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for instance, can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows logically that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind, and thus we're brought not merely to an uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 2, the fine-tuning of the universe. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions of the Big Bang were fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life, with a precision and a delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants and quantities, for instance, the gravitational constant. These constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities put in as initial conditions upon which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy, or the balance between matter and antimatter in the early universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by even a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. To give just one example, the atomic weak force, if it were altered by as little as 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power, would not have permitted a life-permitting universe. Now, there are 3 possible explanations for this remarkable fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, it can't be due to physical necessity because the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. In fact, string theory predicts that there are around 10 to the 500th power different possible universes consistent with nature's laws. So could the fine-tuning be due to chance? After all, highly improbable events happen every day. But the problem with this alternative of chance is that the odds against the fine-tunings happening by accident are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. The probability that all the constants and quantities would fall by chance alone into the infinitesimal life-permitting range is vanishingly small. We now know that life-prohibiting universes are vastly more probable than any life-permitting universe. So if the universe were the product of chance, the odds are overwhelming that it would be life-prohibiting. In order to rescue the alternative of chance, its proponents have therefore been forced to resort to a radical metaphysical hypothesis, namely that there exists an infinite number of randomly ordered, undetectable universes composing a sort of world ensemble or multiverse, out of which our universe is but a part. Somewhere in this infinite world ensemble, finely tuned universes will appear by chance alone, and we happen to be one such world. Now, wholly apart from the fact that there's no independent evidence that such a world ensemble even exists, the hypothesis faces a devastating objection. Namely, if our universe is just a member of an infinite world ensemble, then it is overwhelmingly more probable that we should be observing a much different universe than the one we in fact observe. Roger Penrose has calculated that it is inconceivably more probable that our solar system should suddenly form through a random collision of particles than that a finely tuned universe should exist. Penrose calls it, quote, utter chicken feed by comparison. So if our universe were just a random member of a world ensemble, it is inconceivably more probable that we should be observing an orderly region no larger than our solar system. Observable universes like those are simply much more plenteous in the world ensemble than finely tuned worlds like ours, and therefore ought to be observed by us. Since we do not have such observations, that fact strongly disconfirms the multiverse hypothesis. On atheism, at least, then, it is highly probable that there is no world ensemble. The fine-tuning of the universe is therefore plausibly due neither to physical necessity nor to chance. In addition, what serves to distinguish chance events from design is not simply enormous improbability, but also the presence of an independently given pattern to which the event conforms. For example, in the movie Contact, scientists are able to distinguish a signal from outer space from random noise, not just by its improbability, but by its conforming to the pattern of prime numbers. The fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life exhibits just that combination of incomprehensible improbability and an independently given pattern that are the earmarks of design. It therefore follows logically that the best explanation is design. Thus, this argument gives us an intelligent designer of the cosmos. Number 3, the existence of objective moral values. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. By objective moral values, I mean moral values which are valid and binding, whether we believe in them or not. Many theists and atheists agree that if God does not exist, then moral values are not objective in this way. Michael Roos, a noted philosopher of science, explains, quote, "The position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory." Like Professor Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality which has emerged among these imperfectly evolved primates we call Homo sapiens is objective. On the atheistic view, then, an action like rape is not socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, there's nothing really wrong with raping someone. But the problem is that in moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Just as we are rational to trust the deliverances of our senses, that there really is a world of physical objects out there, so we are rational to trust the deliverances of our moral apprehensions. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse are not just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and justice are really good. But then it follows logically and necessarily that God exists. Number 4, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. Historians have reached something of a consensus that the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and to demonstrate the truth of this claim, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the ultimate proof of his claims was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually 3 established facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1. On the Sunday following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist, quote, by far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2. On separate occasions, different individuals in groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent New Testament critic Gert Ludemann, quote, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by unbelievers, skeptics, and even enemies. Fact number 3. The original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising Messiah, and Jewish beliefs about the afterlife prohibited anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. N.T. Wright, an eminent New Testament scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me that the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. Finally, number 5, the immediate experience of God. This really isn't an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from argument, simply by immediately experiencing him. Philosophers call beliefs like these properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on other beliefs. Rather, they're part of the foundation of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs include belief in the reality of the external world, the belief in the existence of the past, and the presence of other minds like your own. When you think about it, none of these beliefs can be proved. But although these sorts of beliefs are basic for us, that doesn't mean they're arbitrary. Rather, they're grounded in the sense that they're formed in the context of certain experiences. In the experiential context of seeing and hearing and feeling things, I naturally form the belief in a world of physical objects. And thus, my beliefs are not merely basic, but properly basic. In the same way, belief in God is, for those who know him, a properly basic belief, grounded in our experience of God. Now, if this is right, there's a danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract your attention from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes an immediate reality in their lives. I, for one, am someone who has experienced God as a living reality in my life, most especially in the last 5.5 years. So in conclusion, then, we've seen 5 good arguments to think that God exists. First, from the origin of the universe from nothing. Second, from the incomprehensible fine-tuning of the universe. Third, from the reality and existence of objective moral values and duties. Fourth, the historical evidence concerning the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And fifth, the immediate experience of God in one's life. Now, if Mark wants us to believe instead that God does not exist, then he must first tear down all 5 of the arguments that I've presented, and then in their place erect a case of his own to prove that God does not exist. Unless and until he does that, I think that theism is the more plausible worldview. Thank you.
like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. It's nice to see all the faces. It's been lovely debating with Devin. Okay, so I'm admittedly a skeptic about this. I think we don't have the evidence to warrant unguarded belief in this. So I'm going to try to match Devin's arguments as well as possible and try not to talk past him. I'm going to start with the cosmological argument and proceed from there. I think Devin's argument and William Lane Craig's argument misrepresents to some extent what contemporary physics actually provides us with reason to believe. There's a good deal of physicists in the community who believe that we can actually now map further beyond, further prior to the Big Bang. They believe that there's a promising field of quantum gravity that we can explore, that we can use to explain actually how the Big Bang occurred, not just that the Big Bang is the stopping point and that anything beyond that requires some other type of explanation, a supernatural explanation, a non-naturalistic explanation. And so physicists believe that it's fairly possible that a universe preceded the Big Bang, for instance, as one possible explanation. They think that the universe and the Big Bang might be evidence for a prior universe, that there is a kind of looping effect in which the universe kind of arises out of a Big Bang and collapses into another one. And this process repeats itself. And I don't think we have a whole lot of warrant in saying outright that that is impossible. I think that mathematicians, for instance, will actually not agree with the claim that infinity is impossible. Further, the Borde-Vilenkin theorem, which William Lane Craig relies on in some cases, is actually developed by a group of scientists who were using it to model the possibility of a multiverse, not a single universe. And that theorem is also not currently empirically testable. So if we're going to say that the multiverse, because it's untestable, is not worth our consideration, then perhaps we should take it to be the case that this same thing might also be untestable when we're saying that the universe had to have a definitive starting point. However, it should be qualified that it's not just that this has a definitive starting point. It's a definitive starting point of inflation of the universe. The physicists who developed this theorem, Borde-Guth and Vilenkin, have said that it's only necessary that there's a start to inflation, and it's conceivable that the universe might have been caused from prior quantum events, and that those aren't going to qualify in the same sense as substantial physical objects because they aren't visible in that sense. And so we can't map those in a temporal sense. They're not going to constitute something which is present in the history of the universe so that we can say, well, there was this time prior and we can measure it. There's nothing to measure in a sense because there's no physical events to measure. And this doesn't mean that there isn't something there which is immeasurable, and that's going to be these quantum forces. In terms of the not scientific reasons for doubting the cosmological argument, but the logical or philosophical reasons, I think it's incredibly difficult to map a physical, or not a physical, but a necessary attribute to the cause, to say that the cause must have the same qualities which we would expect it to have if it were an empirical thing, that it must be a mind. This seems a little bit premature in our evaluations. This seems like we're jumping there and we're doing so without having all the merits of the position. And I think further, this whole model is built upon the belief that the world operates more like a watch than it does a seed, and I'd like to spell that out a little bit. If we say, well, the world must have had a cause, and it must have had a cause because the physical objects we find have causes, watches have causes, watches have watchmakers, then we're implicitly suggesting that the world is something which must require an external cause to make it move, in a sense, to make it develop. And I think it's plausible to expect that the world might be something more like a seed. It might have intrinsic properties which cause growth. And it seems we could say that maybe there's something that could make the world necessarily exist. In response to the fine-tuning argument, I think there's something a little bit fishy about the logical form used here. And it works basically like this. The world's finely tuned, which means that there's some very precise things about it, and we recognize those as being highly improbable in their own right. And we can spell this out a little bit more. So let's say there's some possibility A or not A. And A or not A is going to be true always. It's always going to be the case that either A or not A obtains about the world. Then we could say, and when we're evaluating this purely from the point of logical probability, we don't rely on empirical data for this. We rely, because we can't evaluate whether the world is the particular way it is in terms of features about the world, but we must rely on something preceding that, so we can rely on logic here. So let's say that it turns out to be true that fact A is true of the world, and that's going to be a 50% logical probability. If it's the case that fact A and fact B are true about the world, then we can do some basic mathematics and say, okay, so it's a 50% chance of this and a 50% chance of this. That's going to be 0.25 or 25%. If we have a third variable, that's going to get down to 0.12, and this will continue. Now, when we get to looking at the way the world actually is, it's going to be incredibly improbable that the way the world happens to be this particular way. And we infer from this that there must be something which made it specifically that way. And I think we're not safe in making the leap from this fact to the fact that God finally tuned it, because that's to say we're explaining this by positing something even less probable. If we're saying God created this and God did it because God is omnipotent and has these other have infinite variables associated, then that's going to be less probable, because we're then claiming that it's not only is the world the way it is, but it must be the case that the world could be slightly different, that the world could be pushed to be in an altered way, and that's going to require that more facts obtain. So it becomes less probable, and so we're relying on something less probable in order to assert that something more probable has occurred, and I think this is a little bit unsafe logically to do. Let's see. Then, okay, on to the point about objective moral values. I happen to be a moral realist, so I think we can definitively say there are some acts which are morally wrong. However, I don't think that this requires that we say they're transcendentally wrong. I'm not sure what that means, actually. I think that we can look at some features in the world. We can say, look, it turns out that if you boil babies, that causes them a lot of pain, and that's bad. We shouldn't do that. And it's because they have certain features about their physiology. It's because they can feel pain. And it's because we can recognize that we shouldn't do that, I think. And where Devin and I differ on this point is I don't think it's necessarily something all people feel. I mean, I think there are people who are sociopaths, and if Devin's argument is true, it seems to entail that maybe we shouldn't believe there are sociopaths who don't feel this thing. However, I believe that moral truths are dependent in part on mathematical systems, and that we could imagine some act being permissible by any person in a particular case scenario. So we can say, look, okay, this person has these specific features. Another person has these same specific features in the relevant sense. that qualifies them for the same moral treatment, and we shouldn't treat them in significantly different ways. We shouldn't treat them as though one person were less deserving of respect than another. I think that would be morally unjustifiable. And I think this problem, however, is better treated by something like this approach than to use explanations concerning God. I think if we say that, if we recognize that there is evil in the world, and I think we should, there seems to be gratuitous instances of evil. There are, for instance, genocides that have gone on for 50 years. There are mass amounts of discrimination. We have only moved beyond fairly egregious amounts of discrimination in the past 50 to 70 years, and still it persists. And we shouldn't think that there's a justifying reason for which that might be permissible. There shouldn't be a reason we say that, well, maybe there's something mysterious about this. Maybe we just don't understand, and there's something that's going to be good that comes out of this. I think that moves us too close to a position of moral nihilism, and we shouldn't accept that. I think that we can recognize that there's going to be cases where the consequences can't justify certain attitudes. There's going to be cases where we have to recognize that something is morally egregious. And I think that that's going to be hard sometimes when we claim that God created the world. God is, in relevant senses, perfect. He's omnipotent, he's omniscient, and he's perfectly good. I think that is going to push us into a paradox, because if we recognize that evil exists, then, and we recognize that gratuitous evil exists beyond that, then it becomes hard to say that, well, it happens to be the case that God created the world and finely tuned it and made it just the way it is, and then this happens. And I think that we can't just say that, look, we have free will, because then that puts us into another problem. Because then we have to say, well, look, it's possible that God could create something and not know the consequences of it. It would be like saying, well, look, okay, we've got an engineer, and the engineer is producing these mechanisms and throwing them into a machine and seeing how they fare. And because he's omniscient, he knows the prior fact that this one's going to behave improperly and it's going to be necessary to throw it out. And that seems to be a problem that the engineer has produced and has knowingly produced it. And I think when we're pressed with this problem, it seems like we have to forgo one of these premises. We have to sacrifice something. We have to either claim that gratuitous evil doesn't exist, and I don't think we can make that claim. It seems to be very evident that it does. Or that one of the features found in God doesn't exist, and that puts us in an awkward position, I guess. Let's see. Now further, has anyone played telephone? There's far fewer people than I expected. Okay, I guess you might have to take this on faith, but I promise you can test this out yourselves later. In the context of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I think we should take it with some more information. If you do happen to play telephone, then you might find that when you do that, and you have a sufficiently large number of people, then what the last person in line hears might be somewhat different than what the first person said. And that's going to mean that we're not always getting accurate information when there's a lot of people involved and when there's a fairly significant temporal distance. And that is the case when we're looking at something that happened some 2,000 years ago. There's a fair number of people, apparently, who believe that The economic collapse of 2008 happened during Obama's administration. And when we have the media infrastructure, which we do, the ability to fact check and whatnot, that should be a little bit concerning. That even when we have all this information and the ability to fact check, when we have such an integrity in the kind of information we can acquire and that we can check is veritable, then we should be concerned about something that takes a lot longer. And historians record the first gospel being written some 25 to 35 years after the purported events of the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't have the kind of media infrastructure we do. They couldn't Google it and check to find out that there were newspapers and whatnot declaring it. A lot of this also happened over a fair amount of physical distance, and people pass this around from one to another, and I think it's probable to believe, first in the context of them not having this media infrastructure that we do, and second in the fact that their scientific explanations were much less advanced, that we could expect that there would be a fair amount of superstition. And recent studies in cognitive psychology show that, like, when a person dies, and that's fairly weighty on a person's psychology, they sometimes see those people. And we can explain that by means of psychological science. And it's because you have these strong emotional connections with them. And then there's the fact that there's the temporal distance, and that's important. This is 25 to 35 years after that, and there are revisions going on in Scripture up until around 125 when we first have records of, and that we can actually go and find in the Vatican if you're interested. This means that it's incredibly hard to actually verify that these four facts Devin has mentioned are something we can put a lot of stock in. I think that it's quite probable that the degradation of the information we've got has outweighed the possibility that we can reliably hope that this purports to represent the world as it is. Let's see. Okay, that's 2 minutes early, I think. Yeah. Are you done? So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for those opening remarks. That was very interesting. So managing time is going to be my difficulty here because that was a lot, so I've got a lot to cover. Okay, so the first argument from the origin of the universe, Mark says that the Kalam misrepresents contemporary physics, that there's many physicists who believe that we can look at worlds beyond our Big Bang, and he appeals to quantum gravity models. So looking at these quantum gravity models, though, Alex Vilenkin, the champion of them, says, the picture presented by quantum cosmology is that the universe starts as a small, closed 3 geometry and immediately enters the regime of eternal inflation, with new thermalized regions being constantly formed. In this picture, the universe has a beginning, but no end. So the champions of quantum cosmology themselves admit that the universe has a beginning on this. Additionally, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to quantum models. Vilenkin writes, or the three of them in this quote actually, say, a remarkable thing about this theorem is its sweeping generality. We made no assumptions about the material content of the universe. We did not even assume that gravity is described by Einstein's equations. So if Einstein's gravity requires some modification, our conclusion will still hold. And where this becomes relevant is currently the Big Bang Theory gives us a physical model of the universe back to the first split second of its happening. That's known as the Planck time, which is 1 times 10 to the negative 43rd power right after the universe universe happened. We can't get back there because at that point, gravity becomes united with the other physical forces like electromagnetism and the atomic nuclear forces, and we don't have a quantum theory of gravity yet. So appealing to the Big Bang theory for the beginning of the universe has been a problem because of the lack of our quantum theory of gravity. But the amazing thing about the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is that it applies to all of those models, and it also applies to the multiverse as a whole. Vilenkin, concluding this, pulls no punches. He writes, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Additionally, postulating that the universe is infinitely old leaves you with other problems as well. Namely, that we see that the universe still has a lot of heat and energy in it that is not completely localized. So if you guys are familiar with the concept of entropy, where a little bit of order spreads, and physicists have predicted that if the universe continues expanding as it does, it's going to come to a point where there's no more localized heat, and it's going to be spread as a global mesh throughout everything. And if the universe were infinitely old, then that heat death of the universe should have already happened. So there's additional problem there. On the oscillating models, physicists have recognized that the universe's cosmological constant, which is responsible for the expansion rate of the universe, has shown that the universe is expanding too fast for gravity to pull it back together. So this idea that the universe can expand and contract and expand and contract doesn't fit with what we know. Additionally, we don't have any physical models that would allow a bounce through a contraction. Hawking and Penrose in their singularity theorems showed that that wasn't possible. Then he says mathematicians don't agree on infinity. Here it's important to distinguish between types of infinity. You have potential infinities and actual infinities. A potential infinity is when you go on and use infinity as a limit that you're always approaching but never get to. An actual infinity is a number, namely a number of an infinite amount of things. And mathematicians have recognized that the actualization of an actual infinite is only possible in mathematics, not transferable to the real world. And I could give further examples if I had more time. He said the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem was developed for the possibility of the multiverse. That's fine, but it still entails a beginning of the universe. He says that we have nothing to measure, no physical events to measure. That's right, but we can look at our universe and extrapolate back and figure out what happened, and all of our evidence shows that it must have had a beginning. Then he says it's difficult to map the necessary attributes of the cause. We're being premature. By no means. I gave arguments as to why the cause needed to be a personal creator, because it transcends space and time, meaning that it's immaterial, changeless. It brought all of the universe into being, so it must be unimaginably powerful, and I gave an argument for its personality as well. All right, so moving on then to the fine-tuning. He said that the world is finely tuned, but it's possible that there might be other alternatives or explanations for this fine-tuning. It's going to be improbable any way the world is fine-tuned. What's going on here, though, is that he's conflating two premises, namely that any universe with observers will appear to those observers to be fine-tuned, with the claim that it's probable for a universe to be fine-tuned. And it's enormously improbable for our universe to have the constants and quantities that it does. And here's why that's significant. Imagine this analogy. Imagine that you're dragged before 100 trained marksmen to be executed. The kill order is given, and you hear the roar of the guns. But then you realize that you're still alive. All the marksmen missed. What should you conclude? Would you say that since you're still alive, you shouldn't be surprised that you don't observe that you're dead? Of course not. Even though you're still alive, the enormous improbability of that being the case cries out for the explanation, for an explanation. The same is true of the universe. Then he said that it's less probable for God to be the creator, but I didn't hear an argument there, so I'm not sure what his argument is there. Then moving on to the moral argument, he says we don't need God for transcendental moral truths, but he says that he does believe in them. Well, my question is, how can you get morality in a universe that is only matter? On naturalism, humans are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust and are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. There's nothing special about humans on this view. They're simply another arrangement of matter, the random consequence of chance and time. Our assumptions about moral values are simply the byproducts on an atheistic view of sociobiological evolution. If you want to affirm that morality really exists, you need a ground that would say, okay, this is right, this is wrong. Otherwise, who says, right? Because if we all say, hey, Hitler, you were wrong, Hitler's to say, who are you to judge me? Right? And so you need a transcendent standard that is beyond what we say in order to judge things as really good or evil, right or wrong. Then he moves on to the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil is interesting here. He basically presents the following argument, which is a classical version of the problem of evil, which would say, if God exists, he would not allow pointless evil. 2, there is much pointless evil in the world. 3, therefore God does not exist. Now, here's the crucial problem with that argument. It's premise 2, the idea that pointless evil exists. And its being pointless is very important. But here's the issue. Philosophers have discovered that there is a hidden premise in the premise. Namely, when you look at the world and say, there's pointless evil, what you're actually saying is, because I can't see a point to it, therefore there can't be any. But this is ridiculous. Just because you can't see a reason for some suffering doesn't mean there can't be one, especially given our limitations in space and time. If any of you are familiar with chaos theory or have seen the movie The Butterfly Effect, you remember how one action in the past could move and move and move to where it creates a vastly different future. We're simply not in a position to know the significance of events that happen or not. So God's reason for allowing something could be years in the future. And because we are limited in space and time and intelligence, we are simply not in a position to say with any certainty, yes, this evil truly is pointless, because we don't know the effects of how it compounds on itself. In addition, this argument actually, I would say, presupposes the existence of God because it's appealing to an objective moral value. So if you want to affirm that evil really does exist, then you're right back in the problem of the moral argument and how can you make that claim. So the problem of evil actually stands on the existence of God to try and undercut the existence of God. I think that this Alvin Plantinga has a great quote about this. He says, could there really be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if there were no God and we just evolved? I don't see how. There can be such a thing only if there is a way that rational creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live. A secular way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort, and thus no way to say there is such a thing as genuine and appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, and it's not just an illusion of some sort, then you have a powerful argument for the reality of God. Let's see here. I have a lot more on that, but I'll move on to the resurrection argument. Okay, so here he says that we can't have very much confidence in the facts that I presented, and he says the Gospels were written 25 to 35 years after the events. The game of telephone would show that, maybe they were a lot different from how it originally happened. The thing here is that historians and myself are not justifying these events by saying that the Gospels are historically reliable accounts. What they are saying is that the Gospels are historical documents that we can mine for information, and we can judge those documents using various criteria to try and extract any genuine historical information. Examples of this would be the criteria of independent attestation. If you have two sources independently of one another reporting the same event, it's very unlikely that they made that event up. Likewise, if you have sources that are reporting something that is embarrassing to them, for instance, the idea that women discovered the empty tomb in a culture where women's testimony was not valid, it's very unlikely that that would be made up. And so when historians have looked at the Gospels and applied these criteria to them, they've been able to mine relevant historical data, and that's what the three facts are based on. Then he says that in regard to the post-mortem appearances, when somebody dies, it's possible that that person really meant something to them, and we have evidence of people seeing their loved ones after their loved ones pass away. Absolutely, but that doesn't explain the situation here. First off, most of those people who see their loved ones after their loved ones pass away don't think that their loved ones have been physically raised from the dead. The fact that they're hallucinating them or seeing a vision of them is to them proof that they are dead, but that they're speaking to them from that other realm. Additionally, these hallucinations happened not only to individuals, but to groups, skeptics, and even enemies. So this idea that, the disciples were so distraught about Jesus' death doesn't carry over to explain all of the data that we have. Let's see, what else did he say there? And he says, superstition might be rampant, First Gospel of 20. I think I answered most of the main stuff that I wanted to get to. So I do believe that all 5 of these arguments still stand. The only argument that we've seen in favor of atheism was the problem of evil, which I've shown we can't have confidence in that crucial second premise because of our cognitive limitations, and it also presupposes the existence of God to try and disprove him. So for all of those reasons, I still think it's more plausible that God exists.
Kind of made me tired listening to. And again, keep in mind the echo of the thing. All right, and go.
Okay, so in terms of this quantum gravity stuff, this is a growing field, so perhaps this offers us a very promising scientific endeavor. We might now have the opportunity to have a better mapping of the way the world works. We might have something that might turn out to be either confirmation or denial of a thesis. That thesis being that there's some necessary being outside of the world that created it. So let's see what science tells us in a few years, I guess. On an auxiliary note there, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem scientists have claimed, at least according to my research, that there's no necessary beginning of the world. There is, however, a necessary beginning of inflation of the world, and those are two different things there. One claims that it is possible for there to be a fairly null state in which there's no observable changes in the world. However, once inflation starts, once there's been a Big Bang, then there's going to be a fairly standard rate which we can measure, which is going to be exponential. That is going to have a definitive starting point, and there's going to be a relation between consequent states of the expansion of the universe and that prior state. Guth also said, conceivably, everything might be caused from nothing. There doesn't seem to be a strong reason we can't rely on this idea of quantum gravity, and this is going to be an open scientific question which will inform us as physicists progress with this, I think. On the points that there has to be some transcendent personality which created the world, I think we're unwarranted in making this jump, and I'd like to spell that out a little bit more now. So if we're claiming that it has to be transcendent and it has to be immaterial, and it has to have a personality. First of all, to say that it has a personality seems to be just a brute assumption. I still haven't gotten the reason for that, and I think that warrants skepticism. Second, when we're making these claims, it seems as though we're importing empirical concepts. I look at a watch and I assume it has a watchmaker. And this is going to be true of some things in the world, and some things this analogy is going to hold much less. When we claim that a tree has a maker, I think the analogy becomes tenuous, as I've said. When we're talking about morality, I think Devin's position pushes him into kind of an odd place. I'll map out here how I think morality might operate. We can watch consequences of our actions. We can measure those. We can come to understand the causal relations between certain physical actions which we perform and the consequent effects those have on people. We can come to recognize that those are either good or bad for them. And it's important here that it's good or bad for them. It's going to affect their physiology. It's going to affect their ability to govern themselves. It's going to affect the way in which their lives play out. And it's going to affect them sometimes fairly significantly. I think we can say that some effects on persons are bad, And I think it's because of the effects it has on them. If you throw a baby in boiling water, then that's bad for them, and it's bad because of the effects it has on them. It's because they're sentient and they report that we become very cognizant of that fact. And I think it's hard to say when we try to import moral value outside of the world and say boiling a baby is bad because of something outside the world, then we actually no longer have an objective truth. To say that something's objectively true is to say that it's true in virtue of some features of an object, in virtue of a baby having sentient characteristics, and in virtue of it being able to feel pain. I think that's why it's worthy of moral consideration. And I mean, I think also that many animals are worthy of moral consideration, so I suppose we'll differ there too. Further, I think that we can say that certain states are good or bad, and we can do this by looking at the relation between our moral terms. If we say something's bad, then we mean that it harms something good, or that if something's good, then it can't be the case that that becomes a final state in an event. It can't be the case that that prevents future good. And we can look at consequent states and see that these might mirror, in some sense, the mathematical relations between these terms. Suicide, for instance, is bad because it prevents good. And when we're looking at moral reasoning, it's the reasons for which we act which give our actions moral worth. It's because we realize that persons are worthy of moral consideration, that they're actually people we should respect. It's because of the features they have and the features of them, rather than features that some other being has. It's not because we happen to value them. It's because they're valuable themselves. And it's not the case that they're valuable because some other entity, even God, values them. It's because they have features which make them worthy of moral consideration. And I think this becomes particularly interesting in the context of the argument from evil, because according to Devin's response, God is inherently a consequentialist. This should be a little bit shocking. It should be shocking to us that it's the case that the consequences can always justify some action. I think we should be concerned more with principles than consequences. I think principles are more morally relevant than consequences. And we can also achieve some set of consequences by multiple means. If you want to become rich, you don't have to be an accountant. You don't have to be a CEO. There's multiple ways. In the same sense, if recognizing the existence of God is good, then it doesn't have to be the case that you're tortured for that to come about. And to say that it is necessary that that is the case is, I think, a little bit, it contains some hubris, and we shouldn't allow that. When we make these assumptions that anything can be permitted, we're actually becoming much closer to moral nihilism than we are to recognizing objective moral facts. We're claiming that, well, maybe there's a justifying reason for that. And when we import this into every case, when we say maybe we shouldn't take action here because we recognize that there might be something we're just not thinking about, then I think we become much closer to moral nihilists than moral realists. And that's a danger we should stay away from. We should recognize that there's some things which can't be justified by their consequences. And if we're claiming that there may be something good which comes out of something, and so we fail to actually recognize that there's an ill, then I think that's much closer to moral nihilism. And when the claim is made that moral truths are dependent upon God, but that same position forces us into this position of nihilism, then I think there's something very strange going on. In response to the resurrection arguments, I think we need to be cognizant of a few things. First, that women discovered Jesus, according to the stories, does not seem to be incompatible with a particular story that the Gospels of Mark were interested in creating about Jesus, that Jesus was an outsider, that Jesus was not understood wholly by anyone. This seems to be very much in line with what the Gospels of Mark might have been aiming to portray of Jesus, that he was, in some sense, not somebody we could understand. There was something more to him than any of us could actually grasp at. Second, that there's multiple attestations to the fact that Jesus was resurrected. I think when we're taking this in the context of this being developed by a historical document, then we might wonder whether there are interested parties in this. And clearly, there were at least some interested parties. The church of the time might have had, or the precipitants of the church might have been very interested in being able to build a case for this. I mean, if you can make it the case that many people identify with a common interest, then you have a very powerful and compelling reason to motivate those people to act in some particular ways. I mean, we should not forget that when you can motivate a whole lot of people to do something, that sometimes provides military power, and that obviously was the case sometimes. The Crusades are a testament of that. How am I on time? Okay, I'm good. Thank you.